Hi, everyone. I'm Erik Moraczewski, and here with me today is my co-host, Dion Brown, the Managing Director of Nonprofit Strategies at NMBL Strategies. And joining us today, we have two great guests, Rebecca Kelly and Justin Childress. I've had the good fortune of working with Rebecca at Gallagher & Associates, designing museums around the world. Rebecca joined Gallagher after working at Michael Graves' design group, working on the rebrand for Target, among, I'm sure, many other things. Since then, though, she's focused on experiential brand strategy for Hickock, an award-winning architecture and design firm. Justin Childress joins us today. Justin's the creative director and partner at Switch, a strategic branding and interactive design studio. Justin also teaches at SMU's Masters of Arts and Design Innovation grad program, and he's also a director of digital and brand for Deep Vellum Publishing, a nonprofit literary publisher. And so we're really excited today. We're going to be talking about graphic design and how they impact cultural attractions. Really going to be a fun show. Please feel free to drop in the comments or in the question and answer any questions or thoughts you might have that can be shared with our hosts or any of the other guests with us. With all that said, I'm going to jump right in. When we were talking on Thursday last week, Justin and Rebecca, we were talking a little bit about when looking at graphics and especially branding, you both mentioned needing to be future thinking and for the design to have an enduring quality. And one of the things I learned as a numbers person working at Gallagher & Associates with a bunch of designers was the evolution of colors over the years, the evolution of fonts changing in popularity, and all that really, I think subconsciously, you start to find what time period something is from with those, even though you maybe don't know you're thinking that, you see something as dated, even though you don't know necessarily why you see it. Maybe you as graphic designers know why you see that, but the rest of us, us mere mortals, don't necessarily know that. How does a cultural institution then, look at forward-thinking design and enduring quality when we do start to recognize those things subconsciously? Anyone? Dive right in. Justin.
Unmute first.
I feel like this is a very loaded question.
I know, right?
That's why I gave it to Justin first.
Rebecca, I would love to hear what you have to say about that.
Oh, wow. Look at that pivot.
Yeah.
I think, so I'm not sure if I'm going to really answer this the way that you're looking for an answer, but I would say that as graphic designers, you're constantly doing research and looking at what's out there and what your clients' competitors are doing, just to stay current and to make sure that each project you create is as forward focused as possible. And then even with EGD work for the built environment is making sure that the things you're creating can be updated as needed by your clients.
Yeah, I would definitely echo that. And I think, that's kind of the trick with something like graphic design is just like any sort of expressive activity, I guess, it does sort of go through trends, just like anything. And I think I would sort of liken it on some level even to something like architecture, I guess, as far as there are, even though ideally the structure in buildings last maybe even longer than, a bunch of text or something like that. But it has, you can sort of tell from what era a lot of times or what sort of ideology was popular when something was designed and built. And I think that sort of the form of language does that same thing as far as whether it's the typography or the colors or the sort of visual textures. And I think that whenever, kind of to echo Rebecca, thinking whenever we're dealing with institutions that obviously don't want to redesign stuff every 2-3 years, they want something that's going to be flexible and dynamic long term. I think that the two things I try to talk to my clients is talk about, number one, what is the character of the institution itself, or the city even that it sort of lives in, what spaces it live in, and how do the visual choices you make reflect those things, those sort of values of your audience and your organization. And then secondly, to exactly what Rebecca was saying, anticipating it evolving over time. So figure out where are those places where you can, where do you plant the flag of like, this is integral, this can't change, and then how can you sort of year to year or season to season introduce elements that keep that fresh. So I think that is kind of the trick.
Yeah, so I promise it's all just going to be easier from here on out. I thought I'd start difficult and we'd work our way down. By the end of this, we're just going to ask you to spell your name. So it'll be fun from here on out. But when we think about kind of what you guys just talked through, what do you see as hiccups along the way that groups find that they have, or what could they do to kind of avoid some of those hiccups so that they can have more of an enduring quality? Because I think, as someone who has bought these services, but not necessarily, I can't draw you a stick figure. So how do you get me as a buyer to be forward thinking? Because sometimes it's probably hard. It's easy to say, I like what these people are doing, but oftentimes when you're saying like, oh, I like Google's logo or something like that, you're actually looking at something that was designed 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And so, how do you inspire?
I think that one thing that's important is design is so gray. Everyone has their own preconceived ideas and they may not even realize it. And so putting something black and white to it, really having some strategy to fall back on so that as things start going down that path, like, oh, can you make my logo look like Uber's logo or something, when it has nothing to do with what your client's product or services are, is coming back to that strategy to say, here are the things we're trying to help you achieve. And does that match that?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think that the kind of what I wrote down here is I think that if we're talking about hiccups and sort of common maybe misconceptions, whenever somebody walks or a client sort of walks into that room, it is kind of a common misconception is that we are there and the first thing we should think about is how something looks. Sort of Rebecca's point. When in fact, that's kind of the last thing we deal with. First, we deal with like, who are y'all? Like, who are you? Like, what is your, as an organization and all this, who are your people? Who are your clients? Who are your, who do you need to appeal to? Because it can very quickly become obvious what's disingenuous sort of visual outcomes when it doesn't sync with the organization itself. So I think that definitely.
Justin, on that same level, what you teach at SMU, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So with who you're teaching, how are they grasping this? I know it's design and innovation, but does that tie into the future?
Good question. Well, I think that if I were to sort of distill the program where I teach is not necessarily it's not a graphic design program or anything like that. But if I could sort of identify something specific, it's basically a design research program. And that speaks very much to what you're talking about as far as like how do you get into a space and ask the right questions to a group of people to be able to help identify what their needs are, what sort of cultural, like internal cultural identity they have that they can express outward. And I think that I do sort of talk a fair amount about the process of design being a process of translation. So you also can't, we as designers can't go into a space and expect our clients to be able to verbalize their needs in the same language that we can. Otherwise, they would do that. They wouldn't hire us to do that. So a lot of times, I sort of, kind of to the point of teaching. It's teaching the students to be able to communicate with people and then be able to translate their needs and their language and their personal perspective into something that the rest of the world out there understands through what you put out there, you know, if that makes sense at all.
So, you know, thinking through that, you know, how we talked a little bit the other day, you know, social media has completely changed how we think about our own brands, how we think about how we're conveying ourselves to the public. What are some of the changes you've seen over the last 10, 15 years? You know, really 10, 15 years, we're probably talking about the beginning of both of your careers. So obviously, you kind of lived through a little bit of probably a graphic design renaissance, just more on how maybe graphic design is utilized and appreciated, I would say. Perhaps, you know, I think back to some of the museums that Rebecca, you worked on and I looked on from the outside looking in. You know, one of the things that I remember a lot of the senior team at Gallagher talking about was, you know, at this point, 40, 50 years ago, you know, you really kind of threw some stuff at a wall, you put in the artifacts, and it really changed in the last 20, 30 years of storytelling. And you're walking through a living story. And I think graphics play such an instrumental part in that. What other kind of major changes are you guys seeing besides, you know, from both the built environment as well as through social? I don't know what you guys are seeing changed over your careers.
I think that they're looking for things to be authentic. They want to know that if especially with like a brand, that what they're seeing is really what the brand is actually, what that company is actually doing and putting out. And I think in space, you know, thinking about the built environment, and you're talking about storytelling, is that finding that way to blend digital and static content to tell that story that makes sense and doesn't feel forced, but ways, because that again goes back to the idea of staying current and being modern and being able to update things as needed. And digital, of course, gives us that ability. But there's something to having something static and tactile and being able to put your hands on, especially in an exhibit environment, which people still crave, of course. I mean, people still pick up magazines and pick up books, even if they've got a Kindle on the side. So.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think if I were to sort of identify a couple, and admittedly, again, we talked about this on Thursday, definitely not a social media expert or anything like that, but I think that from a brand perspective, probably the biggest thing that I've seen over the last few years has been just how almost expected it is for organizations or companies to sort of exist on every platform, if you want to say that. So a few, 10 years ago or so, there's Facebook and there's Twitter, and that was kind of where people lived, with some other sort of tertiary ones. But now it's kind of like you're expected to create a brand that can exist on everything from, LinkedIn to TikTok, basically, and so the trick is then how do you create something that is cohesive, that has a cohesive element between these very, very disparate types of media and disparate types of sort of attention that is required for those. And then how do you sync that to the physical environment, like that Rebecca's talking about, as far as that very tactile space, or being in, like, literally in a space, in an interior where you don't want somebody on their phone. That's literally counterproductive to what you're doing. So I think that is probably the biggest evolution that I've seen over the last few years. Makes it challenging because it's changing every 3 or 4 months. It seems like there's something else you have to start thinking about.
In my experience, working in cultural institutions / museums, it was at the initial design phase with the graphics portion, the conversations I had with the graphic design team was paramount because they had in their mind, I had in my mind, what we were looking for, and it took us working together, and they hit it on the spot. And what I found most rewarding is that they listened to what I wanted and they incorporated. Can either of you speak on it, or Justin? I believe you just helped Oklahoma City Art Museum launch. How did that go?
It went pretty well. So, and shout out to my team up in Oklahoma, Scott and Julie and Brian, who did the most of the work on that project. But I think there's two sort of tricky things I know that we sort of have to work through an institution, specifically something like a museum, like the Museum of Art there. And number one, of course, it was the budgetary aspect of it, which I think is very, very real in a space like that. And then secondly is just the massive number of people who want to be involved in something like that. So, which isn't necessarily, if there's anything that we love, it's when people feel invested in the project, in the process and the project. But I think that, that can be challenging. And I think that, at the museum, we had the benefit of having a really awesome team on the museum side who we, before we even got to the point of presenting actual design work, there was a huge amount of sort of foundational relationship building that happened there, through this sort of strategic exercises that we did about sort of identifying not only who they want to be now, but who were they? Like, where have they been? What are their needs for this brand? And so I think that, and where we sort of landed on something like that is we need something that can be a flexible vessel for all of the sort of the exhibit oriented stuff and the event oriented stuff and all of that. Very, very to distill it. It's a very simple space, but I think that, that's sort of the biggest. I think that went really well because we spent so much time building the trust of the people that we were working with, and then also not, and this is just the value that we have, but we are here to be partners with our clients. We're not here to like tell them what is like aesthetically this is what you need to do, because this is what's cool. And I think that tends to make the process quite a bit easier.
Rebecca, tagging on that, when you were doing museums like the Holocaust Museum or the College Football Museum, did it get to a point where the project has been around for so long that the designers take over from the staff? Have you ran into that? I know an organization now that's fighting that the designers have been involved longer than the current staff is. So that they have taken on ownership, and you hear in the background the staff saying we should do this, that, or that. Did you ever run into that in any of your business when you were doing the museum side?
Well, I would say that sometimes the client team will change because a project might go on for years and years. And so I think, and I was actually thinking about this when Justin was just talking about one of the things to keep in mind too, is that oftentimes the client is not the same type of person that matches the end user. And so making sure that even though you are solving for your client needs, that ultimately you're trying to attract that end user, right? And so I think, Dion, what you're mentioning, I mean, that makes complete sense, right? It's like, even though the client side might have different people over time, really in the end, you're solving for the end user. So as long as you've got that in mind, it works out.
I think we talked a little bit about that last week, that how you do that. We talked about whether it's personas or what you're doing, but it's a common issue within nonprofits in that whether it's a client or whether you're talking about museums and a major donor has an opinion that may be different than what the end user would be, becomes a very difficult process sometimes when someone has their checkbook out, right? So, what are some of those things that, how do you bring them back towards the visitor, towards the experience more so than the person?
With creativity.
Well, yeah, I think to your point, Erik, I think if I were to sort of distill it down into this singular thing, it's really focusing from day one on the value, on the power of research. So I think that there is this misconception, maybe, or sometimes a misconception around something like graphic design being a purely aesthetic exercise. So it's something where it's like, ooh, you went to art school and now you're gonna like make us something visual that is, looks good, which is hopefully true. Hopefully that's true. But I think that it's only effective if we can, or we can only demonstrate its effectiveness by sort of setting those goalposts from the beginning. And a lot of that, if you do it right, is formatting the structure of the research around, whenever you're having something like interviews is a great way to do it. It's like, can you, our client, can you please give us the names of 10 people that you want to appeal to, whether it's like a donor or whether it's, somebody who's on the board, or whether it's somebody who's been a member of the organization for 10 years or whatever. Like we want a wide array of people who are going to be affected by this brand and who are not you. It's like to Rebecca's point, we talk a lot about like, we're not designing for the client, we're designing for the client's clients, ultimately. And so we find that if we can sort of start there and sort of come back to the client and say like, here's what we found out, here's what people prioritize, here's what they respond to, here's what they expect from y'all as an organization, and then sort of sync those to some profiles or some personas or something like that where we can build that. I think that does help clients sort of extract themselves out of that process a little bit more. So yeah, I think that research is the word that I use there.
I think that's important, and I think the data is there now more so than ever. We talk a lot with clients or with anyone else about the ability to understand and use the data, but also making sure you have the right data in front of you. Data can also be manipulated fairly easily. If you ask 3 people that are all board members that all are best friends, you're going to get one answer. And if you survey visitors, you may get a different one. And so you need that mixture of everyone to make sure that you're getting the right inputs to your information. And I think that's so important. I think whether you're talking about, brand strategy or whether you're talking about marketing strategy, I think that holds true throughout, is that you don't want to ignore a donor's perspective to it, but you also can't have that be the only input that you take when you go through it. The other thing that we kind of talked through all of this is having someone that owns the brand. So after you get done, we when we work on a strategic plan, the thing that we kind of reiterate to people is this shouldn't just be put in a book on a shelf and dusted off next year at your board meeting to say, oh, what happened here? Or, 5 years later to say, oh, I guess it's time to build a new strategic plan, because there's no value to that. I mean, if you don't have someone actively engaging the brand, whether that's, our own brands, as we were talking a little bit about last week, or whether that's, our clients having someone that's actively engaging the brand, I think that's a critical piece to it as well. Do you guys have any kind of thoughts of how they can best engage the brand, whether that's your own brands and things you've seen at your own businesses or at some other cultural institutions over time?
Well, I think that, Erik, that kind of brings up a good point too, in thinking about, it's kind of going back to something we were talking about earlier, that Justin had mentioned, that, a brand's not a logo, right? A brand is so much more than that. And so making sure that whoever your brand owner is really, you know, speaking to your brand. And so anything that's being posted on social media sounds like you. Anything that's going out into the world looks like you, sounds like you, and represents what that brand that's been created. And, you know, we always put together a style guide, right, when we're done a project. But to your point, Erik, it might just be sitting on a shelf somewhere. Hopefully it comes to life in other ways and it doesn't need to be referenced all the time. But
I think too, identifying a couple of things, identifying what the limitations should be around that particular brand, because a lot of times different organizations have a different set of a different comfort level around executing within their brand. Some of them, you know, some of them don't. But I think that it doesn't do anyone a service to provide them with a set of tools that they feel uncomfortable using or that they're not going to use. I think a very simple example of this is a blog. It's like, it seems almost default that, you know, it's like, well, a great way to get some, you know, some SEO traffic and get your name out there and post all that is to have a blog. So, you know, well, they'll do a blog. And 90% of our clients don't have somebody on staff who's going to write blogs. And so what that does is, if you give them the tool and they don't use the tool, then they feel like they're not getting sort of the value from the engagement. And so I think that making sure, you know, there is whatever tools we provide to them or whatever we put in that toolkit, there's somebody who feels comfortable using that tool, or they have the understanding that they're going to need to seek that person out and find that person. And Erik, you know, I know that you were sort of talking about, I sort of shared some stuff about Switch and how, you know, even as a branding firm, the exercise of sort of refreshing a brand and sort of getting it out there was extremely difficult. Until we sort of specifically, made a couple of hires with the knowledge that they are very, very good at, you know, at this aspect of branding, as far as being able to utilize common tools and understand how to reach people in different social channels and stuff like that. And it's something that we had all the tools beforehand, but we didn't have somebody who could do it well. And so I think that that's the case in pretty much almost any context. But
yeah. I think when you get designers together, anytime there's a design related piece to it, you're going to get a lot of opinions. You know, Rebecca and I lived through designing our office at Gallagher, and people showing up while it was being renovated and with, oh, well, I want, you know, this and this. And you're like, no, like the time for comments is over. You know, otherwise it can live on forever, and you can kind of end up in a bad cycle through it all. You know, and I remember working for Ford early in my career in their credit side. One of the things that came out was accountants are some of the worst people at paying their own bills. And so, like, I don't know if there's just a truth that, like, when you leave the office, you don't want to think about what you've done all day. And so maybe designers feel the same way of, like, you know, I don't want to think about my brand. I've got to think about my clients' brands all the time. And, you know, or the other thing we talked about was carving out that time to really own that brand. I think that happens a lot for any of us, in that you say, okay, there's only X amount of hours in the week, and some of that's going to family, some of that's going to whatever else, and then I've got X amount for work. You know, I can't say no to a client, and therefore I don't have time to handle my own brand or my own forward thinking to any of it, and that's a mistake, but it's an easy one to make. Dion, you look like you were going to say something brilliant.
I was, but I was so engaged in what you were saying, it slipped my mind. Oh, I know what it was. It's about the branding guide. And you guys talking about sometimes it just sits on the shelf. And unfortunately, from an ED perspective, I walked into 2 different organizations, and they've done this great work, and they know the fonts, the colors, the color palettes and all, and just gets put to the side. And what I found when I got there is that everybody's just doing their own thing. They had one template that was old, and they just went with it. And so it's important from an executive director or any leadership position to bring it back in and make sure you're standing on your branding in your lane, so to say. So I commend you all for the work that you do. And I use it, try to.
So we like,
Well, and I mean, even to that point, Dion, brands evolve too, right? And so even after a design firm's been in there and set everything up for you and giving you the kit of parts to use, that's not to say that down the line that brand is going to start doing this or this, right? So as long as you're being true, yes.
You're nimble.
Yeah.
and I think too, that's a great, you know, of course I'm running through scenarios in my head when I know that's happened. And I think that's a good example. Like there can be very simple and practical reasons that a brand doesn't remain consistent across an organization. And the one that we always run into is typefaces on a computer. So it's like, if you have your brand fonts, and of course, you know, of course, we like to use like cool typefaces a lot of times, and they're not cheap necessarily, like per license. And it doesn't, once again, doesn't help the brand if we spec something that nobody in the organization has on their computer or has that, you know, the ability to get. And so that's something that we've tried to get better about, sort of getting in the habit of, like, when we walk into speccing a brand, being like, who's going to need to use this? Like, is it going to, do you have a brand manager on site and they're the only ones who are going to touch this stuff? And so you can buy a license for this thing and it's going to be consistent? Or do you have 50 people all doing their, you know, their own individual small little projects, and they have a constraint to, like, they're constrained to their system fonts or to open source fonts or something like that. And so that helps us be able to make the right choices as a design team, so that we don't, you know, we don't sort of give you homework from day one and to go track down 50 font licenses or something like that.
Setting them up for success.
Right, exactly.
I'm gonna pause real quick and just remind our audience, we'd welcome you to add some questions in the Q&A down below on the screen. You know, make it easier for Rebecca and Justin to answer questions if we know what questions you have. So
As long as they're not hard.
Yeah, that's my
Like the
job.
one that Erik posed me.
Yeah. Dion gives you the nice ones, and I like to be the difficult one. That's kind of our relationship that we have with everything. So it's good that we're consistent. You know, it's just like that brand. You need to be consistent. You know, when you were talking about that, the first thing that comes to mind is email signature lines. You know, I mean, especially with the fonts that you talked about, Justin, is someone just copies someone else's email signature line when they started a business or started a company, and they don't have that font on their computer, so they've pasted it, and it looks basically the same, you know, when they've copied and pasted it. Then when they hit send, it changes into, you know, maybe not wingdings, but but more along those lines. And so, you know, it really is important, or just to make sure that you've got that consistency and the availability, and like Rebecca said, the simplicity. You know, I think that's really important as well.
Hey,
So, yeah.
I'm gonna interrupt 1 second. Hey, Justin, I know people are looking at your hat like we did last week. Can you explain your hat and get that out the way now?
Oh, sure. Well, you know, I'm at the point in quarantine where my hair under the hat looks completely ridiculous. So I'm just leaning into the full-time hat thing. And this is a Japanese baseball team, their historic logo, Tokyo Giants. So that's what it means. Little baseball love.
We got one quick question. So talk about some of the examples of creative work you admire, and especially on the cultural attraction side, things that really inspire you to, you know, give you that wow moment of like, wow, that was really impressive. And are there individuals or are there organizations that you really feel are doing a great job with that right now? mean, besides your own. I mean, obviously you Switch and Hickock Cole are the top of the pile, and then everyone else who is trying to play catch up.
I think that right now, well, I feel like we're not going anywhere. And so I haven't stepped into new places. So I'm not getting that kind of those creative juices, unfortunately. But I think just as far as following people and paying attention to who's putting things out there right now, I feel like Blue Cadet is, and we actually just recently worked on a project with them for National Association of Broadcasting, but they're doing a really great job of looking to see what's next in the museum industry and how people interact, even with digital interactives, and what that looks like. And now in the world right now where no one wants to touch anything and there's touch screens everywhere. And so what does that look like? And I think that they're really on the forefront of that and looking to see what's next.
Yeah, that question is pretty paralyzing. I feel like I need to go into my like archive. I think as far as sort of groups that are doing that well right now, I'm going to be hyper specific just as a case study because that's all I can think of right now. But there's a group. This is a little bit out of, obviously geographically out of our wheelhouse, but a group called Spassky Fisher that's in Paris, and they've been doing probably my favorite museum of all time is in Marseille. It's called the Musim, this musim.org. And the reason that I love it is because, number one, the architecture is incredible. And then secondly, all of the graphic identity and all of the material, and then all of the interactive installations are completely cohesive in a way that not only is compelling and functional, but also it feels very, you can hear the sound of the voice almost. It's like you walk in, you're like, oh, this place has a voice. So that's a hyper specific example. But I think as a case study for how I sort of see all this stuff working together, I love how they've done it. So yeah, check that out if y'all want.
I would definitely say, continuity makes such a big difference, from the architecture to the exhibits or architecture to park space to branding. It doesn't necessarily have to be done by the same people, but it does need a continuity across it all, because if you don't have that continuity, you just feel very disjointed, and you walk through a space and feel like, who were the 7 people who fought over this? And I have a specific space in mind when I say that, and it's closed now, but the museum in DC always felt that way to me, is that it just felt so disjointed. And I feel like I can say that since they're closed now. But it was always too bad, because it had the opportunity to be such an incredible place. And it did have some great things in there, but it never felt like the architecture and the exhibits were married together. We do have a question in the chat. Can you please discuss roadblocks that can occur in the creative branding process with clients who may not like the direction you presented? Do you supply multiple ideas and what that cutoff might be? And most importantly, discuss meeting critical deadlines and keeping promises to your clients. Go Frogs.
That's my old college buddy, Erik Hoff right there.
We appreciate Erik for being here. Good name, although he misspells it. I think if Go Frogs is up there, I think you're up, Justin.
Okay. Good question. All right, Erik. Let's see if I can answer this for you. So I think, yes, there is always, we operate in what is at the end of the day a highly subjective world. So, as far as what graphic design is. So it's one of those things where, and if I had a great fear that of a question Erik was going to bring up today, it was like something related to metrics. And I'm like, I don't have a lot of metrics around this because, it's something we're dealing with people's minds, what do they like in their tastes. and they're some of which are reasonable and some of which aren't really. And so I think that, it's inevitable that we're going to walk into the room and present some work a few times a year, and the client is just going to be, what on earth? Like, are you even, like, what is this? And so that happens. It does. But I think that the way that we try to avoid that is kind of back to that research thing. So it's like, we build trust over time by saying, here's, what your people are looking for. And then we do go through an exercise often of doing sort of a mood board exercise, if you want to call it that, where it's like, let's look at a bunch of different other brands out there and talk about what we like about them. And then figure out what of those things is relevant to what we're doing. And why do you like it? Do you like it because it's green, or do you like it because it makes you feel like relaxed? Why? And so working through that exercise or series of exercises, we tend to get to a point where we can at least be more targeted in our actual design work. And then we do often in our standard sort of structure, we do present more than one direction. Usually I would say 2, no more than 3. But, and so we'll present this stuff that's very targeted based on what we've all decided collaboratively with the client. And then we always make sure to show whatever it is that we're doing in a real context. So it's like, we don't want to just, there was this in design school, it was back whenever it was like, a logo has to work in one color black on white, and you put it on the wall and it has to work. And the fact is, nobody ever sees a logo in one color on a white wall. Like, no, it has to get something from that. So what we, to sort of avoid some of those difficulties, we if you're doing a museum, something for a museum, then you show mock-ups of things that they're going to need to use in order to sort of sell the concept, so that they can sort of get past the actual logo and get to how is this going to be used. And so, I think that's probably the biggest thing that we've started doing in the last few years that's helped us be a lot more, consistent in sort of hitting it. But we also, this is the last thing, I promise the last thing I'll say on it. But the other thing that we make very clear from the beginning is that what we show in those early rounds, that is a starting point. Like, that isn't, we're not coming to them and saying, here's your finished project. We're saying this is step 1 of a conversation we're going to have around what's going to work for you eventually. And so having a sort of a humble attitude, if you want to say that, and being very overt about that, saying like, you're probably not going to like certain things about this, and that's fine. That's why we're doing it this way. Let's sort of talk about that. I think it's been helpful for us.
Waiting for Rebecca to just say ditto.
Well, seriously, yeah, I agree with everything Justin just said. And I think we always, like Justin said, we always present more than one option. And typically we like to present options on a spectrum. So this one might be like really safe, and this one might be way out there, knowing that in all likelihood, we're going to come back somewhere in the middle, and you're going to be taking some pieces that you like from this and some pieces you like from that and bring them into what really works for the client. And I think that if you wind up finding yourself in revision after revision after revision, it kind of goes back to what Justin was saying, and go back to the beginning. You look at your black and white and figure out what are those core pieces that you need to be achieving in your brand, but then also figuring out how to, like the example Justin gave with the mood board, is figuring out how to work with your client to be able to empower them to say what's on their mind. Because a lot of times they may not know what it is they don't like. It's more like, I don't like it, but I don't know why, right? So I think figuring out how to work with and communicate, and let them communicate with you in a way that works, because no two clients are the same.
I don't even know if this is a legitimate question, but the process that you just got used, I'm putting myself back in the ED slide. So I engage you. What's a realistic timeline for the phases, for a draft to our getting together, just to get an idea the timeline is a year, year and a half, to get something where, how soon should we mesh in that middle point? As you say, you give one end, far end, and then hopefully, if everything goes right, we meet somewhere in the middle. What's that time frame even look like?
What kind of project are you thinking of?
Okay, I'll give you a perfect example. I wanted to redesign a gallery, and I expressed my thoughts to a graphic designer, what I wanted in there. What's that timeline from us engaging, giving you my thoughts on one gallery, not the whole museum, just a 2,500 square foot gallery? Hard question. Unrealistic question.
I haven't worked on a gallery in a long time. Justin?
Well, I'm like, well, I haven't either. I mean, I think that I just looked at the guest list, and my business partner, who actually knows this a lot better than me, is watching. So Jamie, if you want to text me, just let me know. But I think a lot of times that depends not only on the scale of the project, but also on the levels of approval that it has to go through. That's kind of what tends to affect our timeline. So, I think optimistically on the brand side, we can, or I think an equivalent would be like a website. Well, look at that as far as like a virtual room. I think that we can tend to, if something goes very smoothly and it doesn't have a lot of like a huge e-commerce thing, and we don't have to go through a lot of levels of approval, we could do something in 3 months, probably. Would be like a pretty quick turnaround for something that's of a decent scale. Now, if you add on, like we have to design it and it has to be approved by the team, and then it has to go up to the department head, and then it has to be approved by the CEO, then it becomes it's a year, for sure, just because it's this sort of cascading of feedback down and up and all that. So I think that even more than the project scale, it's that organizational structure that affects.
Luckily for me, Justin, I've worked in organizations. I've always been involved with it, regardless of what my marketing team, my graphic design. So we rule out all those extra layers of approval because I'm right there. But I'm not the only one, but don't have time to. I know what you mean about those long delays because of different bubbles, clearances, kickback. And the person who's really got the final decision never see it until the end.
Right. Yeah.
I might add in that it also probably, if you go back to the gallery example, the inputs that are going into it, and you kind of touched on it with the website too, Justin. If someone wants a heavy e-commerce platform, that's going to change your time frame. Just like if someone wants heavy interactives into an exhibit space, the size of the gallery doesn't matter as much as what those other inputs are. That really changes kind of that time horizon. If it's a temporary exhibit of 2,500 square feet, that is just going to be some artifacts that you have in place, and you need to develop some scripts and a story around it. That's going to be a shorter time frame than if you're going to develop interactives from scratch, and what other inputs are going in with it. And so, I think it all changes so dramatically based on, like you said, the input coming in from your team, but also the inputs that are being added into your design, because they need to still feel uniform, but they also change pretty dramatically if you think of adding screens into it and creating original content for it. So yeah, I think, one of the things that I was thinking about kind of as the question came in from Erik, how do you prevent yourself from designing for yourself? And what I mean by that is, like, I think back through the exhibits, and oftentimes I could kind of figure out who the senior designer was on a project because I knew them well enough and knew their other projects, for Gallagher, or our competitors. I could often spot who had done something, and I'm not even a designer, and I could say like, oh, that was done by so and so, it's got to be a difficult process, right? I mean, yes, you're trying to do what the client and the end user wants, but we had a designer that basically only designed in Helvetica. Like that was the only font he would use. And I mean, it looked beautiful, right? Because it's a very pretty font, but every single museum had Helvetica. How do you prevent yourself from falling back into your own patterns?
Wow. Another loaded question, right?
Well, I started off and I lied. I'm not going to ask you how to spell your name. So
I think that we, of course, will, I mean, depending on who you're trained by and where you went to school and who has influenced you throughout your career, you're always going to have some things that you maybe inherently do, whether you know it or not. But I think that if you in the end are really concentrating on solving for a project or for a client, that those things wind up trumping, and those kind of nuances fall to the background. But I think the flip side of that is they've hired you for a reason. They must have seen your other work and liked it. And so maybe it's not a bad thing. I mean, I don't suggest using Helvetica for everything, but someone might like that and say, ooh, I want to work with that person.
There are worse fonts to pick, right?
Yes. What'd you say, Wingdings before?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that, because that's into Rebecca's point, once you get to a certain point in your career, it's very difficult to not have like a voice of some kind. It's just like I dress in a certain way. That's kind of, in my design, even if it has range, is, it looks like it's something I would have made because I made it. But to sort of get past that, the thing that I recommend, especially to younger designers, is number one, never always try to surround yourself with new stimuli, like things you're not used to. So the more that you see that's new and fresh, the more that your understanding of what's possible increases too. So I think, not self-limiting when it comes to growth is very, very hard the further you get into this career, but I think it's pretty key. And then the second thing is just purely collaborate, have a team. I think that making sure that you're not just sitting in your room or whatever, with your door closed and light off, just designing something all the time, because it's not going to be the best version of what it can be. So I think bringing those different voices into the space and trading trading ideas, never having just a single designer on a project if you can help it, makes it less likely you're gonna have this similar solution time after time.
Totally agree with that.
So we're running close towards the end here. If you were going to impart words of wisdom on a cultural institution, on how to engage or the right way to choose a firm like yourselves, whether it's a branding exercise, or whether it's going to be a social media content creation, or whether it's going to be exhibit design, what are some things that you feel like cultural institutions especially might really be valuable pieces of information for them? How to engage, how to select, areas to look at maybe for where to find the right people. Anything kind of that crosses your mind here. I'm going to leave this pretty vague and open, because I think that's going to be way more challenging than if I narrowed it down for you. And I'm here to challenge you.
I would say that making sure that you sync with the people, right? Sync with the firm, and feel like you can have an open dialogue, would be, that's pretty important to me, I think, when I'm working, to make sure that open communication is there. Proven track record kind of goes without saying, right? And I think that, going on SEGD is a a good place to start to kind of see what's out there and see who's out there too.
Yeah, I think I would say, and this is a real like introspective moment, I guess. Make sure that whenever, to Rebecca's point, make sure that number one, you like being in the room with these people. Like that's, that you feel comfortable, that you feel like you can be, that you're heard, but that you're heard and, and there's some, conversation happening. And then I think also just make sure that whenever that somebody, your firm that you're engaging with can clearly communicate what their process is, like from beginning to end. And that you, whenever you walk out of that room, understand how that firm works. In like, what are the milestones? What are the project sections? What's the next step? It's like, how are you going to define your goals, or how are they going to help you define your goals? I think that if you leave that meeting and you're like, they make really cool looking work, but I'm a little unsure of how they get there, then that maybe isn't the most sort of confident place to start the relationship. So I think that that's something I would, that's something we prioritize at Switch. And, I think it does help build confidence from day one all the way to the end.
Any, Dion, any last words of wisdom or items to share here?
Not really. My normal thanking Justin and Rebecca. Been some great, information was valuable. I got several takeaways, and I would be more interested, but I can talk offline about a couple other things. But thank you all.
Yeah, Rebecca, Justin, thank you so much. I do think from my own perspective, I love these conversations. I feel like I learned something so much from speaking with the two of you, even though, as I mentioned earlier, I can't draw you a stick figure. I really do have I've continued to grow an appreciation for all that graphic designers do and really impart on the world. So thank you so much. I also want to mention on February 23rd is our next show, entitled Never Let a Crisis Go to Waste, in which we have Steve Mano from CCS Fundraising and Alan Valentine, the CEO of the Nashville Symphony, joining us to talk about handling difficult situations as nonprofits and cultural institutions. And I think it'll be a really fun show. I can't imagine why anyone would feel in today's day and age they'd have to handle difficult situations, but perhaps even the best of us can find something to learn from that show, just like I know we did today, learning from both of you. So thank you so much. It's really been a great, fun show for us. If there's anything else you'd like to add, speak now or forever hold your peace.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Erik and Dion and Rebecca. This was really cool. So thanks for the invite.
Really enjoyed it, and thanks to all the attendees. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.